Hi, Taylor T. Carlson back with another video for you. I just did a video looking at games that were left off the NES Classic Edition, and today I'm doing the same thing for games that were left off the SNES Classic Edition. A lot of classics on the Super Nintendo, so I had a pretty big list, and I narrowed it down to 10 games, and like I was saying in my NES Classic Edition video for the same concept here, this list is in no particular order. These are just 10 games that I think should have been on the system but were omitted for whatever reason. Once again, I'm not taking games that used peripherals into consideration here just because these retro consoles aren't compatible with those. I'm also not including any imported games here or anything like that, but let's go ahead and get started. At the top of this list, I have Arkanoid Do It Again. This was the sequel to the NES Arkanoid, itself a port of the Taito arcade classic. This game basically dials everything up to the next level, adding in a lot of new enhancement capsules that you can use. You can fight bosses. There's even a level editor that you can use. It's definitely, in all ways, a step up from the old NES game, and it's one that I would love to have seen included here. There's even some great two-player modes. It's not just restricted to a two-player alternating mode like the NES version had. You have both cooperative and competitive modes, so this is one that I think is definitely worth rediscovering. Unfortunately, it was released pretty late in the Super Nintendo life cycle, which by that point everyone else was playing Nintendo 64 games. Next on the list we have Chrono Trigger, often regarded as one of the best RPGs ever released on the Super Nintendo, and it's really hard to argue with that. I mean, there's plenty of alternate endings, a ton of playable characters, an involving storyline, and the characters and monsters were even designed by Akira Toriyama. He's the guy that created the Dragon Ball franchise, and he also created characters and monsters for the Dragon Quest, aka Dragon Warrior series of games. It's one that I would love to have seen on the NES Classic, and its omission here is definitely a disappointment to say the least. Next up, Donkey Kong Country 2. The first Donkey Kong Country is on the SNES Classic, although I would argue the second game is actually the better game. This is the first appearance of Dixie Kong, and with her hair that she can use to spin to slow her fall, it definitely changes the style of gameplay and gives you a whole new way to explore the Donkey Kong world. Next up, this is kind of an underrated classic from the early years of the SNES, Joe and Mac. This, again, it's another game based on an arcade game, but it's a side-scrolling platformer where you play as cavemen who have to rescue all the cave girls that have been kidnapped, and there's a pretty diverse collection of prehistoric-type enemies and some big, interesting boss fights with plenty of boss dinosaurs that fill up the entire screen. There's a pretty wide assortment of weapons that you can get along the way, and it's a pretty involving action-adventure platformer, but at the same time, it never quite takes itself too seriously either. This one is sorely underrated, and it's just a shame it didn't get the revival here that it deserved. Next up, this one's actually a tie, so I'm cheating a little. Mega Man X3 and Mega Man 7. Mega Man X3, of course, being the third game in the Mega Man X series, which is a follow-up sequel series to the Mega Man series set 100 years later, involving robots that have free will. In the third game in the series, you actually have the ability to play as the character Zero for limited periods of time, and on top of that, there are all kinds of new enhancements and even some optional bosses and slightly different endings depending on what happens and who you fight throughout the game. We got the original Mega Man X on the SNES Classic, which is certainly no slouch, but the third I believe to be the all-time best game in the Mega Man X sub-series, and that includes the entries on later, more powerful systems. Mega Man 7 was the first game in the classic NES Mega Man series that wasn't on the NES, continuing that storyline. And this was pretty interesting because we got a lot of new boss characters, new enhancement, a new story involving a lot of those old favorite characters. There's even an item replicator where you can get currency throughout the game and use that to purchase new upgrades. You can also get a Rush search mode in which Rush the dog digs for items, and you can use that to find stuff as well, in addition to buying stuff in the shop. This game also marked the first appearance of Bass, Mega Man's rival. I've got my Bass shirt on right here, and it's definitely one of my favorites in the series. It made a pretty pretty solid, pretty well upgrade into the 16-bit domain. Next on the list, we have NBA Jam Tournament Edition. Now, this was obviously not included due to all the complex legalities and rights issues because it used actual NBA players and had an authentic NBA license, and those are obviously long since out of date, a good 25 years later on. But essentially, it's an arcade-style 2-on-2 basketball game in which there are no fouls. You're encouraged to attack your enemy to steal the ball, and you can do really spectacular slam dunks high into the sky from a substantial distance far away from the hoop. There's even some hidden codes that you can enter in the game to play as some secret characters. Everyone from the game's programmers to then President Bill Clinton. It was definitely an arcade sensation at the time it was released, and the Tournament Edition added in a few new gameplay modes and gimmicks, so it's definitely superior to the earlier released NBA Jam game on the Super Nintendo. Next up, we have Mortal Kombat 2. There were 4 Mortal Kombat games that were released on the SNES. The first game, number 2, number 3, and then Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3. The first game did not play that well, and they also censored out all the blood. Well, they learned from that mistake because Mortal Kombat 2, which I think is probably the best in the series on the SNES, has all the blood and gore intact. There's 12 playable characters and a ton of special moves, plenty of gory fatality moves you can use to finish off your opponents, and definitely stands as one of my favorite fighting games on the Super Nintendo. I'm guessing this was omitted because Nintendo probably wanted to keep it E and T rated on here for the most part. And another game on the SNES Classic omitted, sadly, is Pilot Wings. One of the first games that was released for the Super Nintendo. This is really something of a glorified Mode 7 tech demo, but the game's actually really a lot of fun to play. And that's because you go through playing all these assorted aviation events. You can fly a plane, fly a jetpack, fly a hang glider, go skydiving, and there's even some levels where you get to fly a helicopter and do battle against an evil syndicate who's kidnapped your flight instructors. It's a silly, wacky game at times, and you don't even have to have fun to really enjoy this game because half the fun is failing an event and seeing what your instructors have to say about it. This one was left off the SNES Classic, although it did appear on the Nintendo Switch Arcade feature with the Super NES games that are featured on there you get with your yearly subscription and all that. The next game I've got on here is Rock and Roll Racing. This is an isometric view, top-down racing game, kind of in the vein of RC Pro-Am on the NES with a lot of upgrades you can buy to blow your enemies away. There are multiple vehicles, multiple drivers you can choose from, and there's instrumental versions of classic rock and roll and heavy metal tunes, which at the time was pretty novel. These days you have licensed music in all kinds of games, and it's pretty common, but it was pretty state-of-the-art at the time. This was created by the company Interplay, who eventually became the company Blizzard, who's responsible for some of the best games out there on the market today. And the 10th and final game I'm going to include on this list is UN Squadron. This is based on the Area 88 anime and manga, which revolves around pilots in a mercenary air force who earn money for each kill and do battle with various enemies in the area due to a civil war. It's a great game because earning money for each kill, you get to decide how to spend your money. I mean, do you want to buy new weapons you can use on your next mission, or do you want to save up even more money and buy a new airplane? Different planes are good for different missions, and the different weapons that you can buy, which each plane can equip different things, adds a lot of variety to the gameplay. It's a fantastic game, and I actually reviewed this a few months ago. I think it was the first game review I actually did on my channel, and again, it's one I would absolutely have loved to have seen included here because it's one of my personal favorites. Despite being one of the first games on the SNES, it's aged surprisingly well. What game did you want to see on the SNES Classic that was left off? Any big omissions that you'd like to mention here? Comment down below. Also, remember to like this video if you found it helpful and enjoyed it, and subscribe to my channel. I'm Taylor T. Carlson. I'll see you next time.